The outlaw buried his wife at the station, and the Lakota Chief sent 200 riders to honor. Her snow lay thin across the station yard as the outlaw knelt beside the small grave he had carved with his own hands. The simple mound resting beneath the last piece of sky his wife had ever seen. And though the trains came and went with their iron weight and restless whistles, none of them paused long enough to notice the man burying the only person who had ever waited for him without fear. His coat hung heavy with road dust, his hands raw from travel and digging. And yet, he shaped the earth with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the name the world had given him, whispering words only she would have understood as he pressed the final handful of soil over her folded shawl. The station master watched from a distance with cautious eyes, unsure whether to offer a word or stay silent. For even he could see that grief had narrowed the outlaw's whole world to the length of that grave and the space of the memory it held. Travelers passed behind him, some curious, some uneasy. Yet none stepped close enough to disturb the moment. For the sharpness of the outlaw's sorrow set a boundary more certain than any posted warning. When the burial was done, he remained kneeling, his broad shoulders bowed, not from guilt or fear, but from a weight older than the chase that had shaped his life. And as the wind shifted across the yard, it carried the scent of approaching weather. Dry grass, distant cold, and something else he could not yet name. It was only when the low thrum of hooves began to rise beyond the far ridge that he lifted his head, brushing dirt from his palms as he stood slowly, puzzled by a sound no train could make. The station master stiffened beside the telegraph pole and murmured something about riders. But before he could say more, the first figures crested the ridge. Lakota warriors, their horses cutting firm lines across the pale morning. And at their center rode the chief himself, wrapped in winter furs and bearing the expression of a man who carried purpose rather than threat. The outlaw stepped instinctively in front of the grave as if to shield it, though he knew protection meant little before so many riders. Yet when the chief approached, he did not reach for a weapon, but reined in his horse and looked at the mound of earth with a stillness that did not belong to war. Without speaking, he dismounted and placed his hand over his heart in the gesture of honor reserved for the passing of a woman known to his people. And as 200 riders formed a silent ring around the small grave, the outlaw realized the world had shifted in a way he could not yet grasp. The Lakota Chief stood before the grave for a long, quiet moment, his breath rising in pale threads that drifted across the cold morning air. And the outlaw, uncertain whether to step back or hold his ground, remained still as stone, watching the man whose people now surrounded the station in a ring of silent respect. The station master, who had never seen so many riders gather without a hint of hostility, gripped the rail of the platform as if expecting the slightest movement to bring conflict, yet none came. For the warriors sat their horses in perfect discipline, their eyes lowered toward the burial mound, as though they too had come to witness a story they already understood. The chief finally knelt, touching the earth with the back of his hand, before speaking in a voice calm enough to disarm even the outlaw's instinct to reach for the knife hidden beneath his coat, telling him that the woman he had buried had once shown kindness to a Lakota child, lost on the plains years ago, giving water when others would not, and that the child had grown to be one of the riders who now honored her passing. The outlaw listened without blinking, the wind stirring the loose strands of hair across his brow as he tried to reconcile the life his wife had lived with, the world he had dragged her through. And for the first time since she died, he felt the shape of her goodness rise not as memory alone, but as a truth held by others. He asked how they had known she died here. And the chief answered that the breath of grief travels faster than any horse when it belongs to a woman of mercy, and that a message carried through hands and hearts had reached him before the snow settled on her grave. The outlaw felt his throat tighten at the weight of being seen, not as a hunted man, but as the husband of someone whose life had touched a people he had never known. Yet he did not speak, for the words lodged too deep for clarity. The chief rose again and looked him steadily in the eyes, not judging, not searching, only witnessing, then turned his gaze to the grave once more, as if confirming that the woman's spirit had not been left alone in its first night. The station master stepped closer with hesitant steps, his voice cracking as he asked whether the riders meant to stay. But the chief did not answer him. Instead, he told the outlaw that honor carries responsibility, and that grief carried alone becomes a wound, while grief shared becomes a story strong enough to remain. The outlaw felt the meaning settle through him like warmth against the cold he had carried since dawn. And though nothing about his life had changed in the eyes of the law, something had shifted in the heart of the morning as the chief stepped back, allowing the moment to stand without demand or explanation. The rescue did not come as a clash of weapons or the sudden rise of danger, but in the quiet shift of the morning when the outlaw's strength, held too tightly for too long, finally broke beneath the weight of grief, and he staggered a single step away from the grave, as though the world beneath him had tipped. The Lakota Chief noticed before anyone else, moving toward him with the steady calm of a man who had carried others through storms of many kinds. And when the outlaw's knees buckled in silent collapse, the chief reached out and caught him by the arm with a grip firm enough to stop the fall without making a spectacle of the moment. The outlaw tried to pull away, embarrassed by weakness, but the chief held him upright with the dignity one gives to a brother rather than a criminal. Speaking softly in his own language before shifting into English long enough to say that no man buries a good woman without losing more than breath. The station master, startled by the sudden shift, stepped forward as if to help, but the chief lifted his hand to keep the space clear, understanding that some rescues require fewer witnesses and more respect. The outlaw's breath came unevenly, raw from a night without sleep and a morning without purpose, his hands trembling as he pressed them against his face, trying to force back the grief that threatened to spill over into the open yard. The chief guided him toward the edge of the platform where the rising sun warmed the boards, settling him onto a crate with the same reverence one might give a warrior returning from battle. And one of the riders brought water without being asked, placing it gently beside him before stepping away again in silent discipline. The outlaw drank slowly, the coolness steadying the tremor in his chest, and when he finally lowered the cup, the chief knelt in front of him, not as a leader claiming authority, but as a man offering steadiness to another who had given too much of himself to the world. He told the outlaw that a woman with a heart like hers should not be buried by a single pair of hands, and that honoring her meant carrying the weight she once carried for others. The outlaw listened with eyes clouded and haunted, and though he could not yet speak, he nodded once, the small motion carrying more truth than a spoken answer. The riders tightened their formation around the station, not in threat, but in protection, their presence becoming a shield against the world that had never given the outlaw mercy. And in that stillness, he realized the chief had not simply caught him from falling. He had given him a moment of safety, a rare and quiet rescue from the grief that had nearly broken him in half. The station, once a place of passing noise and restless movement, grew strangely still after the chief steadied the outlaw, as though the land itself understood the need for quiet. And the riders who had formed a circle around the grave eased their horses back just enough to give space without breaking formation, turning the small burial ground into something like a sanctuary carved from winter air. The chief guided the outlaw toward the shade of the freight office, where a crate and a wool blanket were offered by a young Lakota warrior who had the same earnest steadiness the outlaw imagined his own son might have had if life had dealt different cards. And for the first time since sunrise, he allowed himself to sit fully, shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in the slow, painful recognition that he could not carry this sorrow without rest. The chief remained nearby, though he said little, understanding that comfort offered too quickly becomes something sharp, while comfort given through presence alone becomes strength. And the outlaw felt a strange sense of safety take root around him. Not the safety of law or shelter, but of being held in watch by people who owed him nothing yet had guarded him as though they guarded memory itself. The station master quietly fetched hot coffee from inside, unsure whether it was proper to serve outlaws or Lakota chiefs. But the chief accepted the cup with a nod, placing it in the outlaw's hands before settling cross-legged on the ground, like a man prepared to wait as long as grief required. The outlaw drank slowly, the warmth sinking into hands still cold from digging, and his breath began to even out. No longer breaking in the jagged rhythm of a man trying desperately not to weep. The chief spoke finally, telling him that the woman he buried had once carried a Lakota child miles out of danger, refusing to leave the boy even when others warned her that helping would bring trouble, and that her kindness had spread through the tribe long after she disappeared from their lands. The outlaw listened with a heaviness that softened instead of hardened. For hearing the good she had done allowed his memory of her to rise above the sorrow, lifting him into something steadier than pain. The riders remained vigilant, watching the tracks, the ridges, the wind. Anything that might disturb the fragile circle of mourning formed around the outlaw. But nothing came except the slow passage of the morning sun, warming the ground where her grave rested. For the first time since he held her lifeless body, the outlaw felt the edge of peace brush against him, faint but real, carried not by solitude but by the unexpected shelter of 200 riders who had come not to judge him, but to honor her. As the sun climbed higher and the cold thinned into a gentler wind, the outlaw found himself speaking in ways he had not allowed in years. The words pulled from him, not by force, but by the quiet presence of the chief, who remained seated beside him with the patience of someone who understood, rendered that grief often hides behind silence. Slowly, haltingly, the outlaw began telling him the story of the woman he had buried, how she had followed him when she could have stayed safe, how she believed goodness could outlive mistakes, how she never once asked him to abandon the road, though it had cost her comfort and, in the end, her life. The chief listened without interruption, the lines on his face deepening with every detail. For he could see now why 200 riders had been stirred by the memory of a woman whose mercy had crossed the boundaries that men so often used to divide land and people. The outlaw confessed that he had often feared he was undeserving of her, that every time she smiled at him, he felt both healed and ashamed, and that burying her with his own hands had nearly broken the last piece of himself he had left. The chief reached out then, placing a hand lightly on the outlaw's shoulder in a gesture so simple and steady that it settled the trembling in his breath. And he told him that a man is not measured by his mistakes alone, but by the love of the one who stood beside him, and that her courage had not been wasted simply because her life ended in a lonely place. The outlaw lowered his head, overwhelmed by a gratitude he did not know how to voice, and when he finally looked up, he met the eyes of several riders watching him with expressions that held neither judgment nor suspicion, only recognition of a man carrying sorrow with honesty. The station master approached cautiously then, offering a small tin of food, and the chief nodded for the outlaw to accept it, reminding him through that simple permission that even in mourning one must take strength where it is offered. As the outlaw ate quietly, he felt a shift within himself, a loosening of the heavy knot that had trapped every breath since dawn, and he realized he was no longer grieving alone. The chief spoke again, telling him that bonds formed through loss often become stronger than those formed through peace. For they are forged in the part of the heart that knows its own breaking. And the outlaw understood then that this moment, surrounded by riders and sky and the grave of the woman he loved, was the beginning of a bond not of blood or tribe, but of shared respect that would guide what came next, whatever it might require of him. The peace that had settled over the station began to thin as midday drifted toward afternoon, and the first hint of danger arrived not with shouting, but with the distant clatter of hooves striking hard ground in a hurried, uneven rhythm. Nothing like the controlled, unified steps of the Lakota riders who guarded the burial circle. The chief lifted his chin at once, sensing the disruption before the outlaw fully understood. And several warriors turned their horses toward the western rise, where a plume of dust trembled against the horizon. The station master stiffened behind the freight shed, muttering that trouble had a way of finding men even on the day they buried their dead. And the outlaw felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive readiness of a man who had lived too long hunted by debts, enemies, and law alike. As the dust plume grew nearer, shapes emerged. 3 riders at first, then 5, their coats dark and their silhouettes sharp with intention, men who carried the air of those who had followed someone across a miles not for justice, but for revenge. The chief stepped forward without hesitation, raising one arm, and 200 Lakota riders shifted with silent precision, forming a protective half-circle that swallowed the station yard in disciplined strength. Their horses stamping the ground as if marking a boundary no outsider would cross without cost. The outlaw's jaw tightened as he recognized one of the approaching men. An old associate turned enemy, someone who blamed him for a division in their gang that had ended with stolen money, broken trust, and a wound that had never healed. The men reined in sharply at the edge of the Lakota line, their eyes flicking from warrior to warrior, before fixing on the outlaw with a hatred sharpened by years of chasing a man who had chosen a different path, too late to mend anything. They shouted accusations, coward, traitor, thief, and demanded the chief step aside, insisting the outlaw belonged to them, not to the station, not to the tribe, not to the grave he had just dug. The chief answered calmly, saying the outlaw was under his protection until morning passed, and that any man seeking harm must first step through 200 riders who did not break formation for the anger of strangers. The threat in the air grew thick enough to taste, the horses restless with tension, and the outlaw felt the old urge to run coil inside him, not from fear for himself, but from fear that these men might shatter the peace granted to his wife's memory. Yet, as he looked at the line of Lakota riders standing firm in a world that was not his, he realized running was no longer an option. What came next would require standing, not fleeing, and the danger now pressing in from the west demanded a courage he had not yet learned but would soon have to claim. The outlaw stood frozen between the grave behind him and the riders before him, the weight of 2 worlds pressing into his chest until breathing felt like a choice he was no longer sure he deserved to make. The Lakota riders waited in unwavering silence, ready to defend him for the sake of the woman he had buried, while the men from his past glared with a fury sharpened by years of grievances he had never fully answered. He felt the familiar sting of shame rise in his throat, for he knew that part of their hatred was justified. He had lived recklessly, harmed men he once called brothers, and fled when trouble turned heavier than his loyalty could bear. And though he had tried to outrun the worst of himself after meeting his wife, the past had long shadows that reached even into grief. He stared at the ground, torn between stepping forward to face the men who wanted him dead or stepping back to avoid dragging the Lakota into a conflict that belonged to his own sinful history. The chief watched him closely, reading the turmoil in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled into fists, then loosened again as if caught between confession and surrender. And he spoke softly enough that only the outlaw heard, reminding him that cowardice does not come from fear, but from allowing fear to decide one's path. The outlaw felt those words strike something raw inside him, stirring memories of every moment his wife had believed he could be better than the road he had chosen. Every smile she had given him when he doubted himself most. Every time she had stood beside him, even when he did not deserve it. Yet the thought of endangering the Lakota, people who owed him nothing, twisted his gut with a new and heavy guilt, for their honor was too sacred to be tangled in the knots of his past crimes. He whispered to the chief that he should step aside and let the men take him, for he had brought enough sorrow to the world. But the chief shook his head, saying that abandoning oneself to vengeance is not justice, and that standing in truth, even if death follows, is the only path worthy of the woman he buried. The outlaw's breath faltered at the sound of her being invoked, and his eyes drifted toward the small grave where her shawl lay tucked beneath the mound of earth, a reminder of the mercy she had shown others without hesitation. Torn between protecting those who now protected him and honoring the memory of the woman whose kindness had summoned 200 riders, he felt the war inside him tighten into a single question. Would he finally become the man she had always believed he could be? Or would he shrink once more into the frightened shadow that had followed him across every mile of his life? The outlaw stepped forward slowly, not toward the safety of the Lakota line, but toward the open space between the two groups, drawing every gaze onto him as if the whole world had narrowed to the length of his shadow, stretching across the packed dirt. The riders shifted behind him in quiet warning. Yet the chief made no move to restrain him. Understanding that a man cannot borrow honor, he must choose it, even when choosing feels like walking straight into death. The outlaw raised his hands, not in surrender but in clarity, telling the approaching men that he was done running, done hiding behind storms and strangers, and that if they sought vengeance, they could take his life here and end the long chase that had broken more than it ever healed. The wind carried his voice across the yard, brittle and stripped of pride. A confession laid bare before the station walls and the 200 riders who watched with breath held tight in their chests. The men from his past laughed bitterly, calling him weak, calling him a fool for thinking he could wash old wounds clean simply by standing still. Yet even their mockery wavered when they saw he did not flinch, did not retreat, did not reach for a weapon. He told them he had buried his wife that morning, that she had followed him into a life she never deserved, and that he would not stain her memory with more blood. Not theirs, not his, not the blood of anyone drawn into a war she would have begged him to walk away from. The Lakota chief stepped forward then, placing himself deliberately at the outlaw's side, a silent declaration that courage shown in truth must not stand alone. And the riders tightened their formation with a low rumble of hooves that made the ground tremble beneath them. The outlaw whispered that he did not want them drawn into this fight, but the chief answered that honor was not a debt, but a choice, and that the woman they came to honor had become part of their story long before this confrontation. The men from the outlaw's past hesitated, their certainty faltering as they realized they were no longer facing a broken fugitive, but a man who had claimed his life, his grief, and his truth openly. Something far more dangerous to their bitterness than any weapon. Surrounded by 200 riders, faced with a man who refused to strike back, they faltered, sensing the eyes of the station, the chief, the riders, and even the grave-bearing witness. One by one, Their anger collapsed into the hollow space between pride and consequence. And with a final curse thrown into the dust, they pulled their horses hard and retreated down the ridge, leaving the outlaw standing in the quiet that follows storms, the quiet earned not by force, but by the first true courage of his life. When the dust of the retreating riders finally settled, and the last echo of their hoofbeats faded into the far hills, the station yard transformed from a battleground of tensions into a place marked by a quiet, solemn strength. And the outlaw stood in the center of it, with a posture no longer shaped by fear, but by the steady weight of a man who had finally stopped running from the sum of his life. The Lakota riders remained gathered around him, their horses forming a great still circle of witness. And the chief placed a firm hand on his shoulder as if anchoring him to a truth he could no longer deny, that he was not as alone in the world as he had believed. The station master, who had watched the confrontation with the stiff spine of a man expecting gunfire at any moment, stepped cautiously forward and announced that the sheriff had received word of the incident and was riding in with a small escort to ensure lawful order, though even he seemed to understand that the law would be stepping into a story already shaped by deeper honor. When the sheriff arrived, he did not reach for irons, but for understanding, listening first to the chief's account of the outlaw's stand, then to the outlaw's quiet recounting of the reasons the men had come for him. And though none of it erased the crimes of his past, the sheriff saw clearly that justice could not be measured by the trail alone, but by the man who now stood ready to face whatever came with honesty. In that moment, the chief stepped forward, offering his own words to the sheriff, saying that a woman who had once saved a Lakota child deserved a husband who had the chance to repay that mercy with a life lived in responsibility, not fear. And the sheriff, moved by the sight of 200 riders gathered for the sake of a single grave, declared that the outlaw would not be taken by vengeance, but by lawful judgment, and that until the circuit judge arrived, he would remain under the joint protection of the Lakota and the town. The outlaw bowed his head, not in defeat, but in gratitude, for the first time understanding that justice did not always require a scaffold, but sometimes simply required a man to stand still and tell the truth. When the sheriff and the chief clasped hands to seal the agreement, the riders eased their formation, and the outlaw walked with them toward the small grave, where he laid his palm gently on the earth and whispered that her kindness had saved him one last time. In the stillness that followed, the Lakota riders, the sheriff, and the station master stood in quiet union, not bound by blood, tribe, or law, but by the honor owed to a woman whose mercy had carried across years, across nations, and now across a man's entire life. In the days that followed, the station yard softened from a place of grief into one of steady remembrance. And though the outlaw remained under the sheriff's watch, it was a watch shaped by respect rather than suspicion. For each man in town had seen how he stood when danger pressed hardest, and how he honored the woman who had shaped the best part of him. The Lakota riders remained for 3 days, standing guard at dawn and at dusk, their presence turning the small grave into a sacred space that travelers paused to acknowledge before boarding trains or leading horses across the yard. And on the 4th morning, the chief placed a carved wooden token at the head of the grave, a symbol of protection for journeys completed, and told the outlaw that a spirit as generous as hers did not pass alone. The outlaw bowed deeply, struggling to speak past the weight in his throat, for the rider's vigil had filled the emptiness inside him with something stronger than mourning, something like belonging, something like the first breath of a life he might someday deserve. When the sheriff finally escorted him to town to await the circuit judge, the chief and several riders accompanied them halfway, riding at a slow, dignified pace that turned their farewell into a procession of honor rather than departure. And the outlaw felt, for the first time in his life, that he was walking into judgment not as a shadow, but as a man carrying truth openly. In town, he helped repair the station fence, stacked firewood for the widow who lived near the old telegraph line, and sat on the church steps in the evenings, speaking softly to men who had once crossed the street to avoid him. He asked for no reward, no defense, no promises, only the chance to stand as the man his wife had believed he could be. And the sheriff, watching him quietly from the doorway of the jail, began to understand that some transformations come not from punishment, but from the moment a man chooses to live differently for someone who can no longer walk beside him. When at last the circuit judge arrived and heard the full account, flavored with the testimony of the chief, the riders, the station master, and even the men who had once hated him, the ruling was not easy mercy but a fair balance between accountability and earned redemption, allowing him to work under lawful supervision rather than hang under the weight of old sins. Each evening, he visited the small station grave before walking back to town, laying one hand on the mound as if reminding himself who had carried him into his new beginning. And in those quiet moments, he found a purpose steadier than the wandering life he had known, shaped by service, humility, and the memory of the woman who had turned an outlaw's last road into the first road toward peace. Kindness leaves echoes strong enough to guide even the lost back toward purpose. Thank you for walking this trail of grief, courage, and honor with us. May every mercy you've given return to you as peace in the days ahead.